Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about how to compare decimals, and we'll go through 4 different methods that you can teach your students to help them understand the process of comparing decimals. So the first method is the 100 square method, and this method is the most effective when you have decimals that don't have very many decimal place values. Um, 2 decimal place values is the best, like 1 to 2. You can also do 3 to 4 if you cut up the little squares into 10 pieces and then cut those into 10 pieces. But if you have like 5 or 6 or 7 decimal places, the 100 square method is not as effective. So for the 100 square method, basically what you do is you shade in the representation of both of the decimals. So in this case, 0.7 is 7 tenths. So I'll shade in 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, and 7 tenths. And so this shaded in area would represent this decimal. And then to represent the decimal 0.23, I would have 2 tenths. So here's 1 tenth and 2 tenths, and then 3 hundredths. And so that would look kind of like that. And when you compare these 2 decimals, it's obvious that 7 tenths covers much more space than 23 hundredths did. And so we would say that 0.7 is greater than 0.23. And this is counterintuitive to what some of your students will think initially, because they'll just look at the digits and they'll say like, oh, 23 is bigger than 7. But it's important to remind them that this is referring to 23 hundredths versus this one is referring to 7 tenths. And tenths are bigger than hundredths, and so 7 tenths is greater than 23 hundredths. And then the second method is the fraction method, where you write all of the decimals in fraction form and then compare the fractions. So if we look at the decimal 0.465, because the last place value is the thousandths place, we can write this in fraction form as 465 thousandths. And the decimal 0.321, again, because the last place value is the thousandths place, we can write this as 321 thousandths. And the decimal 0.57 has the smallest place value as hundredths, and so we can write this as 57 hundredths. Now, when we're comparing fractions, it's easiest if we have common denominators, and 2 of our fractions already have a common denominator of 1,000. So I can convert this last fraction into a fraction that has a denominator of 1,000 by multiplying the top and the bottom by 10, which will make this 570 thousandths. And now that they all have common denominators, now I can just write them in order. So I look at the numerators, and the smallest numerator is 321. And so that means the decimal 321 thousandths is my smallest decimal. Then the next smallest numerator is 465. And so that tells me that 465 thousandths is my next smallest decimal. And the largest numerator is 570. And so 57 hundredths is my biggest decimal. So the strategy for the fraction method is to convert all of the decimals into fractions and then get common denominators and compare the fractions by looking at the numerators. Another method that you can use to help your students order the decimals is to draw them on a number line. So if I have the number 12.4, that means that I'm going one group of 10, 2 ones, and then 4 tenths. So if I split this space in between 12 and 13 into tenths, and I go 4 of those, that puts the number 12.4 about right there. And the number 13 goes 10 units and then 3 units of 1, which puts our number right there. And because the green point is farther to the right than the yellow point is, that means that 13 is greater than 12.4. And so with the number line method, you basically just draw the points on the number line and look at which points are closer to the right. Those will be the bigger values. and then points that are closer to the left will be the smaller values. And then the last method you can use to compare decimals is the place value method. So the way that this one works is you basically put all of the decimals into a place value chart, and you compare them based on the largest place value. So if I list out these decimals, I'm going to have 3 tens, 4 ones, 2 tenths, and 100th for my first decimal. 100, 2 tens, 3 ones, and 4 tenths for my next one. Then 110, 4 ones, 3 tenths, and 100th. 3 tens, 4 ones, 1 tenth, and 2 hundredths. 0 ones, 4 tenths, 3 hundredths, 2 thousandths, and I don't have this column listed, but I have 1 10,000th. And then my last number has a 1 in the ones column, a 3 in the tenths, a 4 in the hundredths, and a 2 in the thousandths. And one thing you can do to help your students put them in the right columns is to remind them that all of these decimal points separate the whole number place values from the fractional place values. And that can help them make sure they get the numbers in the correct columns. And then the way that you compare the decimals is you look at the largest place value. Because if you have 100 in your number, it doesn't really matter how many tens you have because 100 is bigger than all of the tens. And so you always want to start and look at, well, what's the biggest place value? So in this case, this number right here is the only one that has 100. And so that means that the number 123.4 is the largest number in this list of decimals. And I'm going to go ahead and cross that off now that I've finished it so that I know that I've taken care of listing that number in my list. Then I'm going to go on to my next place value and I'm going to say, okay, what's the next biggest number? Well, I know that it either has to be this number or this number because both of those have more tens than any of the other remaining numbers. But since they have the same number of tens, then I have to go to the next place value to determine which one's bigger. And since they both have 4s, that also doesn't help me determine which one's bigger. But when I get to the tenths place value, one of them has 2 tenths and the other one only has 1 tenth. And so that tells me that 34.21 is bigger than 34.12. And so those will be my next two biggest numbers. And I'll go ahead and cross those off as well so that I don't get those mixed up with the stuff I've already listed. So then I say, okay, well, the next biggest number is going to have to be this one because that's the only number that's left that has any tens. So my next biggest number is 14.31, and that takes care of this number. And the only numbers that I have left are 0.4321 and 1.342. So when I look at these numbers, I'll go to my next biggest place value. And since this one has a 0 and this one has a 1, the one that has 1 is going to be bigger than the one that has 0 ones. And so that means 1.3421 is my next biggest number. And then my very smallest number is 0.4321. And that's how I would list these decimals in order from least to greatest using the place value method. So if you have any questions as you're comparing decimals, let me know. And remember, you want to teach your students several different methods because all of the different methods emphasize different aspects of decimals. And by using all of them, your students will kind of become more fluid in the way that they think about decimals so that they can think about them in many different ways. So again, if you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you guys have a great day.